Okay, so, as people trickle in, we'll get started. Anyway, so just wanted to say thank you very much to everyone who's joined in on the webinar today. What we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be having a little bit of a wider lens on the analysis of the topic of economic recovery readiness from the perspective of labor. So my name's Erika Lougheed, and I'm with the Nipissing NDP Running Association, and I'm going to be your host today. I have muted your mics just so that we can kind of keep things organized, and we have some questions that have been prepared in advance, and we have let the panelists know about some of them so that they can be prepared. Hopefully, if we have some time at the end and there's some questions in the chat box, we'll address those as well. So, yes, this event really, to give you a little bit of a quick background, was in response to a recent event in the Nipissing district that was largely focused on how business shapes communities. It was called Economic Recovery Readiness for the North Bay area. So it's important to know what governments are doing and all levels of governments are doing for businesses and how businesses are going to be best positioning themselves coming out of this for the future of their workforces. But really, I just think that our Writing Association felt that it was largely under-examined, the wider lens of what it means to be economically ready coming out of this. So while businesses definitely are the important driver, it's been pretty important and elevated now that grocery store clerks, truck drivers, the supply chains, healthcare professionals, emergency responders are really holding us all together right now. So on that note, just wanted to introduce our panelists and we'll get right into questions. Sound good? All right. So today we have Tim Deelstra. He's the Engagement and Media Relations Strategist with United Food and Commercial Workers Union, UFCW, if you will. Locals 175 and 633. I want to give a wave, Tim. I don't know.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no. Thank you very much. We're excited. Then we also have Shandel, Valiquette, Sudbury Workers Education and Advocacy Center, and she's the campaign organizer. So thank you very much for coming too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Awesome. I'd also like to welcome Jamie West. He's the MPP for Sudbury and Labor Critic for the official opposition.
Thank you for having me, Erika.
No sweat. I am currently, if you see me frantically hammering my finger, is that my daughter's friend is texting her relentlessly on my iPad where my questions are. So welcome to trying to navigate things at the same time as a family. Anyway, let me just get some of these questions organized, up and ready, and we'll get started. Okay. So the questions, really what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be directing the question to one person, and then we're going to be moving it through so everyone will have a chance to contribute. So the first question here is for Jamie. What we have here is how will we recover economically from this? How we recover economically from this pandemic depends no small part on how we protect people now. So what immediate steps do you think need to be taken to prevent people from falling into poverty and debt?
I think this is a good question, and it relates. I had an earlier conversation with the Chamber of Commerce locally, and it isn't just about business, it's about the workers there as well, because you won't have a business recovery without workers who are successful or who have money in their pockets who could spend in other businesses. So right now, we're in a pandemic and everybody knows that. And people are struggling to make ends meet, and there's a lot of anxiety and concern. And they feel like they're in this impossible situation of how will they pay their bills, how will they pay mortgage, how will they pay rent. And for many people, this may be the first time this ever happened to them. And for other people, it might be something that's happening on a cyclical event, because we really created, especially for young people, a situation where it's become normal for you to have precarious work, which is, in my opinion, completely unacceptable. But the reality is that people are losing sleep over this. And they're worried that they're going to take on debt and their access to affordable debt isn't there. And so they'll take on high levels of credit card debts or payday lenders or something like that. And they'll be paying this off for decades and not be able to fully recover. And so we were hopeful this week when we came back to the legislature. I wasn't there, we're using different rules, but there was a vote, we pushed through the vote. Hopeful that there'd be some support for these people, but basically it was an extension of what's already happening. So what we want to do, and what we're saying we need to do, especially in Ontario, because there's a graphic that's gone around now showing the other provinces and how they're helping. And basically in Ontario, what we're doing is we're looking at the federal government and saying, thanks. We need to do more than that because there are some gaps in the federal program and provincially we can help with it. And so, for example, in British Columbia, they have an immediate fund of $1,000 that goes out to people to catch the people falling between the cracks. And so that's important. And what we have to do is get away from these sort of quick measures and these gut feelings, because a lot of what the province is proposing is just delayed payments. And that's not going to help people. So what we're saying and what we're recommending people is that we have supplementary income, and it basically the cornerstone is $2,000. That people need $2,000 to make ends meet. So if you're underemployed, so if your hours have been reduced because of COVID and you're working say 2 days, 3 days a week, and you make less than $2,000, then we supplement to it. If you've lost your job, we guarantee that you have $2,000. Tied into this as well, and this goes beyond the pandemic, is that people are in social assistance, OW, ODSP. We're in situations now where people are losing their jobs and seeing how little money they really have to make ends meet. And when you think of OW, which is just over $700 a month, imagine trying to find even a place to live for $700 a month. ODSP is slightly higher, it's just over $1,000 a month. But we really have to focus on helping them. And so what we're saying is that we need to help everybody. So people who are working, people who are unable to work, we have to help everybody, because otherwise you can't make ends meet, and we're creating this crisis situation. The best way to help, and the number one concern, and this relates to the business community as well, though, is a rent subsidy. The number one concern people have is losing a place to live, or a business losing their workplace. And what we're saying is that you get 75% if you're a business, 80% if you're a household to pay for your rent, plus $250 per dependent child. Children are expensive. I have 3 of them, just the reality of it. And we need people to feel like they're on solid ground so that they're not just taking on debt. So they're not just terrified of what's going to happen, because that's where you make mistakes. And that's where people make decisions in order to save costs that spread the pandemic. That's where you end up going to grocery stores instead of ordering online or getting it ordered to the front. And so this is how we need to help people.
Thank you. Shandel, do you have any additions to that?
I think Jamie summed it up quite nicely.
Tim?
Yeah, I think Jamie wrapped it up fairly nicely. I mean, if there's one sort of bright side to this pandemic that we're seeing, is that a whole lot of people who are not that interested in government or public help all of a sudden seem very interested in government and public help. And so I'm hoping that that trend continues. You know, the province, I spend a lot of my days these days on the phone with the various outlets of the provincial government, and for people who need it most, they seem to be on the bottom pile in terms of immediate response. And so it's nice that the federal government is doing some things, and that they made announcements today that they're changing the CERB again to try to do this. But these are supports that are going to need to be in place, not for today and not for tomorrow, but for the foreseeable future. And it would be good if we didn't just wait for the world to go on fire to do these things. If we can come out of this going, there's a lot of structural change that needs to happen. And if we build some things now, let's not forget about them in a year or 2 years or whenever we get through this and we have a vaccine. Let's put this stuff in place and to sort of reboot society a little bit to keep everybody in the same direction.
Absolutely. The next question's for Tim. And we had a conversation similar to what this question pertains, but compared to previous generations, young workers today currently hold far less wealth while facing a future full of uncertainty. What structural conditions and decisions should we demand now that establish a better path forward?
Well, again, like I said just a moment ago, I mean, this pandemic has really exposed some deep structural flaws in our laws, in our employment laws, in our society. I mean, When I was a 19-year-old, I bought a house because I was a third-generation cannery worker who had a good full-time job. And there is no possibility that either of my boys will be able to do the same thing. There's no fourth generation available for that because that factory is gone. So, I mean, there is a number of things that we have to look at, I think, in terms of structural change. We have really tried to gear our society away from the traditional jobs that used to provide good income, like those manufacturing jobs. Increasingly, that's disappearing. And that's disappearing not just through being sent to the cheapest possible labor market around the world, but also through automation. We are also seeing a huge change where large sections of labor rights that we fought for, you know, generations to obtain are going away. And this is by abuse of things like temp agencies and things like the gig market, where now there is no real sustainable work that's available. Everybody is expected to cobble together 15 little side jobs to put together. And again, this is part of the reason people are in such bad shape now that the whole world has had this difficulty, is that we have really seen over the years that our employment structure has gone really quite badly, and it really needs to be rebooted. My union, the United Food and Commercial Workers, represents the vast majority of unionized grocery workers in Canada. And in Ontario alone, we have over 70,000. A lot of them are very young and, you know, in some ways are more fortunate than others in that years ago, we were able to build in structure to get those grocery stores unionized so that when they're there, we can at least negotiate for these people and try to put some systems in place. And for non-traditional industries like that, where we weren't able to achieve those sort of province-wide collective agreements, it's really quite bad. So we have a great difficulty trying to do anything in fast food or in the gig market or these things. And even where we've had some success, like the Canadian Union of Postal Workers recently succeeded in unionizing the Foodora food delivery workers. My union was recently successful in unionizing some Uber workers in Toronto. There's going to be years of fighting about that through the labor board and other mechanisms. And it's really unfortunate. And so, again, these are all sorts of things that we need to look at. What is sustainable work? What's the future of that going to be? Do we need to start considering things like a universal basic income if we're really going to see automation come into play? And hopefully those discussions will really realistically happen now that everybody is having a difficulty. Unfortunately, it seems to take everybody having a problem before we can start working on what the solutions are.
Shandel, do you have any contributes to that? Any additions to that?
I think just hitting home the fact that those conversations need to actually happen, and they need to, yes, they're going to be awkward and uncomfortable at this point because we've been almost conditioned that this is how things are supposed to be, but we're seeing that this is what we were told, these are how things are supposed to be, but they're not working. So those conversations are probably going to be difficult. They're probably going to be awkward and uncomfortable, but those conversations need to happen. Until those conversations happen, the ball isn't going to be rolling, and we're going to be stuck in the exact same position, still shouting and still losing our voices, but we're going to, like, the fight will never end. So that's pretty much it.
Jamie?
Yeah, one of my pet peeves, and this was long before I was a politician, is that politicians have to stop talking about jobs and start talking about careers. That we don't have a jobs problem, we have a careers problem. Every single one of us watching this, participating in this, we all know 2 or 3 people who have several jobs and can't make ends meet, lose sleep at night, worry about paying bills, you know, put off paying one bill so they can pay the other bill, get into debt, pay off the debt, go through these cycles of unemployment. And as politicians, we stand up and we count how many jobs people have. We count how many jobs we create, but we don't measure the effectiveness. We don't measure if they have pensions or benefits or if they're well paying or not. We just lump them all in as jobs, as if that's a good thing. That if we close down, say, you know, one of the areas that Tim represents with UFCW, you know, commercial workers, if that closes down and we open up a store that's all minimum wage workers, those are equal jobs. That if we lose manufacturing and we have a couple of contract jobs, those are equal jobs. If we get rid of personal support workers who work for a decent unionized work environment and we replace that with a privatized unit where they make about 17 bucks an hour or 16 bucks an hour, that those are the same jobs. We got to stop talking about those. Also, when it comes to young people, I always think of the importance of education, which I know is important to you, Erika. But you know, across the province, Ontario funds post-secondary education at the lowest levels. And we have some of the highest tuitions across Ontario. And when you look at that, the support that we give to post-secondary is nil. And frankly, what's happening in post-secondary is they're balancing the books by bringing in foreign students, which I'm all in favor of bringing in foreign students, but eventually that well is going to run dry because they won't be able to keep paying higher and higher tuitions. I think that if we expect our young people to get the jobs of tomorrow, which require more education, and they're going to go to school, then we stop as a government profiting off the interest of tuition. And also we get rid of tuition and go back to grants. The way we're successful is when school is affordable. It's the equalizer that pulls people out of poverty. It's what causes people to be successful. It's what drives them to take in innovation, which drives good business. And if we think that people are just forever going to be able to pay higher and higher tuition rates and get less and less for their dollars, we're fooling ourselves. And we really, really got to have serious conversations about this.
Absolutely. Just to give a little bit of context, is we just launched our student emergency fund at Nipissing University, and hundreds of students applied for help within one day. Yeah. So shows you how weak that system really was, and how how it didn't take, in some respects, very much for people to fall right into the hole. The next question is for Shandel. I'm going to focus on you if you don't mind. COVID-19 is creating considerable uncertainty in the workforce, especially in situations where employees are unable to work from home and must continue to attend their workplaces. What are the key considerations surrounding an employee's right to refuse unsafe work?
So the Worker Center, we actually did a webinar specifically on this last week. I'm losing days at this point. I believe it was last week, if not 2 weeks ago, about specifically how to refuse unsafe work. And one thing that we wanted to emphasize with that was that every worker has the right to refuse unsafe work. It's just the process, most of them are unfamiliar. They know that they have that right, they don't necessarily know how. So whether they're unionized or non-unionized, the process might be a bit different, but that right is there. The key consideration when refusing work is that it has to be reasonable. So in the context of COVID-19, you can't just call your boss from home and say, I'm pretty scared, I fear that I might catch it because, the store's just been really busy, even though your employer, say, has put up the plexiglass, they've handed out gloves and masks, they're telling all the workers to sanitize, all those precautions, and you're still calling up and saying, I'm still pretty scared. That's not necessarily reasonable. So there is still some gaps and some uncertainties there that workers aren't necessarily protected, but unfortunately, this is the reality of the situation. And another thing in terms of the process is if you are in a workplace where your employer is not taking necessary and reasonable precautions, so you're still cramped, they're not handing out gloves, they're not telling you to sanitize, whatever it may be, and you do genuinely have a reasonable fear and want to refuse that unsafe work, the key thing is to, which again in the context of COVID-19 is hard to do, you have to stay as close as possible to your work site. So again, you can't call your boss from home and say, hey, you're not sanitizing our workstations, I'm not coming in because it's unsafe. You actually have to go into work, you have to take that initiative to build that case. So one of basically our mantra at Sudbury Worker Center is to document everything, write notes, take pictures if possible, jot down conversations, times, dates, like your coworkers that you're having the conversations with. That's the key thing, is to make sure that you're documenting everything. I do want to point out though that if a worker is refusing unsafe work, saying, I can't work in this because even though I'm an essential worker, I can't come into work because I'm immunocompromised or I'm high risk, whatever that may be, it switches from a health and safety case to a human rights case. So that does change the dynamic. But other than that, it's still kind of iffy in the context is, I fear because I'm dealing with people day to day, I just don't want to go to work. There has to be that reasonable cause. And unfortunately, you do have to go into work. You have to build that case and then go to the Ministry of Labor or call the Sudbury Worker Center or call your employer or call your union if you're unionized. So there are still steps to take. So that's something that we were talking about in our webinar a week or two ago. So, but yeah, like I said, documentation is the biggest thing that we constantly stress. Because if you don't have that documentation and you call us up or you call the Ministry of Labor and say, hey, I don't think that my employer is taking the reasonable precautions, even though I'm an essential worker, you know, they're supposed to be doing these things. And they say, okay, send us your proof. And you're like, then you're not really going to have a case. So document, document, document.
Thank
That's
you.
the biggest stressor, yeah.
Tim, do you have any additions to that?
Well, as you can imagine, I mean, we spent a lot of time as a union dealing with this before the pandemic happened, and a whole lot of time dealing with this kind of thing since the pandemic has broken out. In every jurisdiction around the world, some of the people who end up still working are people in grocery, retail, and pharmacy who we represent. And we also have a considerable amount of members who work in food manufacturing as well as long-term care and other healthcare settings who are working through this. So, you know, the systems that the government have in place, certainly we highlight to our members. We are working very diligently with all of our various employer groups to do what we can to get there. We have had some frustrations, I will say, with inspectors who have come in and from our view have just sort of waved their hands and said, no, it's all good, and haven't really, from the union's perspective, put a lot of energy into really examining why somebody refused work. But we are certainly trying to make sure our membership is as informed as they can be, and that we have got as many systems in place as we can to try to protect people. So that's good advice.
Jamie, any additions?
Yeah, I think that, you know, while the right to refuse is a very important right, it's one of the 3 rights that you have as a worker: your right to know, and your right to participate through a health and safety committee, and your right to refuse. We need to have more conversations about the employer and supervisor's legal duty to provide a safe workplace. Anyone who's taken any course in health and safety always hears about 25(2)H, which just is short for Section 25, subsection 2, clause H. And all it says basically is the employer has to take reasonable precautions to protect the worker. Thinking that you have to get to the work refusal in order to have a baseline for safety is just setting in the wrong direction. The reality is that many workers are intimidated by their employer, if warranted or not, the nicest employer in the world. I remember one of I have workers here who work with me, when one of my workers came to tell me that she was pregnant, afterwards telling me how nervous she was. And we have a great relationship and stuff, but just the dynamic of employer-employee, she was very nervous about it. And so thinking that everything is okay because we're not hearing anything is a step in the wrong direction. A couple of years ago, I was talking with the Chief Prevention Officer for the Ministry of Labor about Section 50s, which prevent you from any kind of reprisal for refusing work or following the Health and Safety Act. Now, he thought it was working really well because there's very few of them. The reality is there's very few because people don't have the wherewithal to fight. And that brings me to the 3rd issue with the work refusal. And Shandel said this earlier, is a lot of people don't know how to do it. And that goes for supervisors and employers as well. My role for almost 2 decades was a safety rep. And a lot of that role was to help the worker and the supervisor navigate the system of work refusal. This is something we need to start teaching in high school or before high school, before kids start going to work, so that it doesn't become a big deal. A lot of people, they hear work refusal and they get terrified. Supervisors, employers equally, because they don't know what to do. It's this big crisis. And really what it is I don't know how I can be safe doing this. Explain to me how I'll be safe. But when you say work refusal, people go into a panic. They don't know what to do. They don't know how it works. The ministry is going to get involved potentially. It becomes very frightening. And really, we have to have conversations about controlling hazards, open conversations with supervisors and employers being proactive and asking questions, coming up with solutions together in order to make this work.
Thank you. I think that I'm going to bring the next question to Tim, because I know that it's pretty hot topic right now, especially, you know, from what you told me about your day. Frontline workers are taking quite a bit on, taking on a lot during this crisis. And we've heard stories about some of them not having enough PPE at some facilities, and many people are concerned about their well-being. What's being done to protect the health and safety of these workers?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, it depends on the workplace sector and who we're talking about. In grocery retail, we tried very early to work with the employers to put measures in place. We had the ability to talk to other unions around the world who had already gone into stay-at-home orders and lockdowns, particularly in Italy. We had a number of conversations with unions in Italy about what systems they had put in place at the grocery retail stores. And so this is where we started seeing the plexiglass shields go up, the social distancing measures in the stores go up, the customer counts. I've had a number of conversations with various people throughout government over the last week about what they can do to offer support to employers around that. And then we have all sort of moved into sort of a public awareness campaign. And this is continuing to develop as the situation evolves. We're seeing more personal protective equipment come into the retail space. So there's going to be face shields started out. One of the great sort of disappointments of my life in the last 2 weeks is I've had to do a number of media stories about workers in retail being spat on by people. And so now we're having to look for things that we never thought should have been a problem. You don't think you have to tell people, hey, don't spit on people, especially when there's a virus going around, but apparently we do. And so we have started to see face shields rolling out for clerks in retail and are continuing to do that. In the industrial units, some of them are very difficult to try to manage with these things because they have a lot of people crammed in very tight spaces on lines to do these things. And so we, again, have tried to work very diligently with those employers to spread out shifts, to slow down production, to make sure that people are safe and secure, that they have masks and gloves and gowns, and that they're sanitizing frequently. And that has been a work in progress, and we've had better uptick from some employers than others. But we all need to eat, and so everybody is very keen on trying to do what we can to keep the food supply chain going. And moving into long-term care and healthcare, I mean, long-term care, I think we've all seen in the news lately, has turned into a bit of an epic disaster in Ontario. And somehow we're giantly behind the rest of the country, in my opinion, in terms of where we should be with long-term care. There is a significant lack of testing that's going on in the system. Even today, with the announcement that the government made about enhanced processes in long-term care, they're still largely only testing people with symptoms. If you're asymptomatic, you're not getting tested. And that's a big mistake because people can carry this disease with no symptoms for some time. And that is happening fairly consistently. We are seeing that there is a supply of PPE that is starting to flow into the long-term care sector more so. Although we have also seen that the advice around masking has changed. It went from you only need an N95 if somebody has symptoms and is coughing to, well, maybe only if they're having COVID. And then we've recently seen orders for everybody to be masked, but it's very unclear where that goes. And it has turned into, long-term care has turned into a real problem. And I think, frankly, the Ontario government has largely bungled that. They seem to be focused entirely on hospital and what was going to be happening in hospitals. And that has led to the detriment of long-term care, and it's now trickling into retirement and home care and other healthcare facets. So there has been a considerable amount of work that has been done and will continue to be done, but I would say that there are still big gaps, especially in frontline healthcare, and this is something that we're going to have to work on hard.
Thank you. Jamie, from the NDP perspective, do you have anything to add? Oh, mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. There's a fan going off overhead, so I hit mute so it wouldn't drown out Tim. I think he covered most of the basics, and I think it's important to talk about long-term care because for a long time we would talk about healthcare. The government would talk about healthcare, but not mean long-term care. And as the opposition, we kept saying, you know, long-term care, nurses, PSWs, and those facilities, and they were missed by and large. There's also, even in healthcare, conversations about PPE for healthcare workers that we had learned from the SARS report. That was out from the SARS report, and we should have been prepared for. We should have known about this coming. I think that the only thing that I would add to this really is about the importance of you and I, just average people, wearing PPE when you go to places. Tim talked about people spitting on people. You're nervous when you're a retail worker and people come in. I started wearing a cloth mask. There was a fundraiser in town, so I bought a bunch of cloth masks for friends and families. And I've started wearing my cloth mask when I go out, and I see a lot of relief in the retail workers, just that you're taking some simple precautions. It's not gonna protect 100% from the spread of COVID, but it reduces the idea of, you know, any kind of particulates leaving when I'm breathing or speaking, which is a big relief, because we're all in this together at the end of the day. For every bad example, there's a lot of good examples of people designing PPE and fabricating it or shipping it. And I think there's just simple things of wearing a dust mask or cloth mask to help relieve the tension is important.
Shandel, do you have any additions?
No, I think everybody said really important things, and that was pretty much it.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, the next question here, I'm going to direct at Jamie. We've seen the Ford government make massive cuts to healthcare and roll back hard-earned labor rights. Do you think the government's cuts have had an impact on our ability to stop the spread of COVID-19 and protect workers? Loaded question.
Yeah, the short version is yes. So you know, to be honest, the government, just about every piece of legislation has a sprinkling of a labor attack in it. This is I say it often in legislation, this is a government that thinks that workers have it too good. You know, and people have seen the cuts of the pain from these cuts. That's the reality of what's happening right now. So last year's budget, for example, they cut healthcare, they cut long-term care, and they cut public health. Right now, we're in the midst of changes to what we're doing with healthcare. That's what we were debating when we rose from legislature in March. We haven't come back to discuss it. But basically what they're doing is transforming and making it easier to privatize healthcare. When I ask directly, are you privatizing? Are you in favor of privatizing? They skirt the answer by saying, you'll still pay through OHIP. You'll still pay through OHIP. Well, we're seeing that in long-term care. We're seeing that in different facilities where you can go for samples and stuff. These are private companies that we're paying through public dollars. And generally the people who work there don't make decent wages, which creates a whole cycle that's going around. Our public health unit, so the basic response for every politician across the country is follow the lead of the public health unit. In the midst of this, the Ford government was cutting public health from 35 to 10. So that means in Northern Ontario that our public health unit will likely be in North Bay or it'll be in Sudbury, but that'll be the public health unit for basically Parry Sound North. So think about the work that they do. And this crisis is just part of the work that they do. There's all kinds of things that public health is required for and important for and essential. So we're cutting funding, we're cutting the number of public health, and that's difficult. When you go to the worker protection side, direct protection for workers, they brought in Bill 47, and that did a variety of things to attack labor, but the one most people know about is it froze minimum wage. The last time we froze minimum wage was with Mike Harris. We froze it through Harris, Eves, most of McGuinty, and then part of when the Liberals started thinking they were going to lose the election. So when you freeze minimum wage, first of all, you have workers who are working and not making enough to pay their bills. Second of all, that argument of too much too soon gets stronger and stronger and stronger. It gets harder and harder to keep up with the cost of living because you froze it for several years and now the leap has to be much higher. We've got to pay a fair wage and tie it to the cost of living and just have it as a normal expense. They also cut the paid sick days. We had 2 paid sick days. They removed those. What they did on top of that, a lot of people don't understand, is that you used to have 10 personal emergency leave days you use for sickness or funeral benefits or to take care of a sick child. There's a variety of ways that you could use them. Well, they cut those from 10 to 8 when they removed the 2 paid sick days. You used to use all 10 for a variety of things that were just unpaid. So they dropped them to 8. They froze minimum wage, and they brought back workers required to get sick notes. The reality of this is that sick notes are a waste of time, and the strongest proponents saying stop doing this are healthcare workers and doctors. It is an absolute waste of time. Anyone who's ever had to go to get a sick note knows that all you do is you exchange money for a note. They don't diagnose you. They just say you're okay today. You're no longer sick. It's a waste of time. It clogs up our system for people who should be working or going to work. It requires people who are sick to go to places where other people are sick and spread whatever illness they have or catch something else from someone else and just gum up the system because they have just a cold, because they're sick with a normal cold and need to take time off so they don't get to rest and recover. They spread the illness around as they get out. It just creates nonsense for everybody. And so I think we all are recognizing, we've mentioned it several times, how this pandemic has just emphasized the shredding of our social safety net. It's broken, and it's been shredded and shredded. And it's easy for me to blame the Ford government because they're the ones in power, but let's be realistic. This didn't happen in the last 2 years. It got worse in the last 2 years, but the Liberals were cutting it as well. We are where we are today because of what happened there. Some people will remember Bill 148, which came forward just before the election, but that took 15 years to come forward, right? And it wasn't quite as far as we should have gone. And really that came down to, oh no, we're going to lose the election, so let's move forward. So during the emergency legislation, they got rid of sick notes, which really, it doesn't matter because employers are still asking for them. I'm having people ask me if they need them. I spoke with a constituent who came back recently from the States, who self-isolated for 14 days, went back to work, and the employer said, I need a sick note from you. This is an employee who was never sick, never had signs and symptoms in the States, the 14 days at home, or showing signs and symptoms when they return to work, but the employer is still asking for them because they feel like they have that right. We also have job protected leave if you're off for COVID-19, but we don't have any job protected leave once the pandemic ends. And they sprinkled some money on healthcare, but that doesn't go far enough. We need to put money into healthcare in a real need. The year before I was elected as a candidate running for the election. And the day after that election, we went to Health Sciences North, which is the hospital in Sudbury, to talk about overcrowding and hallway medicine. We had hit a record that year and we were trying to highlight the issues with it. A year later during the election, I couldn't have a press conference there because it wasn't news anymore. So that hasn't changed under Doug Ford. We're still having hallway medicine, and this pandemic shows that it's getting worse. Also going to workers, you have workers, and we talked about the right to refuse, but we have workers who don't know their rights or are afraid to use their rights because the reality is you need to put food on the table. And if it comes down to losing your job or working at a high-risk job, people will choose a high-risk job. That's the reality of it. That's what happens with people, because if you have kids and dependents, and a lot of people are in that sandwich generation where they're taking care of parents and kids, you can't put that on the line. So you'll risk it, and we have to stop that. I could go on, but I'll let other people jump in.
No sweat. Tim?
Oh, largely what Jamie said. I mean, it's hard to talk to some of the folks in government now and not start off my conversations with, I told you so. Like, we've been trying to talk to these guys about the long-term care system for years now, whether it's the previous Liberal government and then certainly leading into the Ford government. And even stuff that when they were in opposition that they supported us on, like a 4-hour minimum standard of care. As soon as they became government, we can't get in the door to talk to these guys. So, like I said in the beginning of my comments, the one sort of bright spot, if there is one out of this, is that there's no more escaping it. This is affecting people. It's obvious. They can't get around it. I saw Premier Ford in the press conference today more or less acknowledge that to the press when they were going after him about long-term care, that, yeah, okay, like the system is bad and we can't get around it. We have seen what's going on. But this is larger structural problems that have been going on for some time too. Again, I came out of the manufacturing sector as a young worker and as a union representative with UFCW. I couldn't tell you the amount of plant closures that I've seen happen in the last decade, including in North Bay. We had a Canada bread plant there that's now gone, and now there's very little bread production that happens in Northern Ontario at all. So a lot of people haven't been listening to us when we say, look, this ends up becoming a basic issue of food security in this country. We don't right now today in Canada manufacture or produce enough food to feed our population. If we don't import food, we're not eating. And nobody seems to care until there's the possibility that we might not be able to get that food. And now we're scrambling. And it's the same thing with the production of medical supplies. Nobody cared about industry going away until we couldn't get the stuff. Nobody seems to mind these things until it's affecting everybody. So, yeah, absolutely, cuts have had a big impact. That's why we're scrambling now, and we're seeing the government scramble. And hopefully what we can do now is move forward.
Thank you. Shandel, do you have any additions?
No, I think everybody kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's just to reiterate the point. We've hit a wall with all the conversations that we've been trying to have, and now people are actually realizing, like, these are problems, and we've been saying solutions or potential solutions to these problems for many, many years. And maybe it's time to actually start listening and start tearing down this wall that we've been neglecting, and just we'll keep hitting for, I don't even know how long. I'm not even 30 yet, and I'm just really starting to now realize all of the detrimental impacts that all these cuts and all of the legislation that has been slowly narrowing have had, So we need to start tearing down this brick wall that we've constantly been beating against.
So I'm going to just slide into the next, you put a good conduit into the next question, if you don't mind. It's for you. Much of the relief of the government has provided to workers has been framed as an emergency. Well, what we now know, and what I know many of us already know in the audience here, are that these workers are essential. How can we ensure essential workers receive improved pay and improved working conditions permanently post-COVID-19?
Again, a very loaded question. It goes back to that conversation that we've been trying to have that has been going on deaf ears, or, for so long. And we need to start having that conversation. And one of the biggest things is we need to start advocating for this change. We're seeing now more than ever how important all of these measures and everything that we are now being put into place, because we've hit that wall. We're in a state of emergency, but we're realizing that these should have been in place long before a global pandemic hit. Even without a global pandemic, they should have been there. So that advocacy definitely needs to be amped up, and we need to create a movement and put pressure on politicians to ensure that workers are protected financially and socially moving forward. There's no this whole talk of when we get back to normal. That normal's gone. It's been wiped away. So we need to build a better structure financially and socially going forward. Being the Workers Center, we work hand in hand with the Workers Action Center out of Toronto, and therefore the Fight for 15 and Fairness. So the Fight for 15 and Fairness have been distributing a petition called the HELP petition, or Health Emergency Labor Protections, which you can find on the 15andfairness.org website. And it's just one place to start. It's one place to go, and it's one hot minute action, as we like to say. But it gets that conversation started. It gets that ball rolling, and we need to do this now, because we can't stop. We can't say, oh well, the pandemic's over. People were fine before, so they're going to be fine again. It's like, no, eyes are open. You can't just brush it under the rug anymore. So we need to create change for something that's permanent. And it's really crazy that so many people are just starting to realize that these essential workers are in the most precarious situations, which seems incredibly contradictory. It dawned on me earlier. It's like, why are the most essential workers in the most precarious situations? That doesn't make sense. So this is definitely a time to change the situation for the majority of workers for the better, and push to make this idea of better the norm, because we've learned that we can't function when things go back, if things go back to the way they were.
Tim, I know that we touched on this on a conversation on the phone. Do you have anything that you can contribute and your thoughts on essential workers and how to keep their improved pay and working conditions permanently?
Well, I mean, my union was very successful in the early days of this about getting some enhanced premiums for our workers while they go through this, but all of those premiums almost entirely have been framed as like hazard pay or hero pay or a short-term premium that's going to be there. Mm-hmm. And, it is the great irony, as Shandel said, that these are folks who are now calling essential, who 6 months ago, people would have said didn't deserve $14 an hour or $15 an hour, that it's easy work and who cares and anybody can do it. So I think that's important, that we now have an ability to reframe this in people's minds, that it isn't just a simple job, that it is essential work. We all need to eat. We all need people to make the food. We all want to have some sense that when we get older, that there will be some kind of, social network that will take care of us and provide for us and look after us. And so I think Also because this isn't just a limited group of people. In the past, when these things have happened, what has happened often is that it's easy to disregard or ignore what's going on because it's not me, it's just somebody else over there. And what's happening now is it's everybody. And so that has really opened up, I think, people's minds to the idea that this is a conversation that we all need to have and should have. And people are appreciating workers in ways that they have never before. And so certainly as a union, we're pledged to do what we can on behalf of our members and work to improve their lives always. And we will work very diligently to try to maintain not only these premiums, but more go forward. And we do these things. And what will be helpful for us, frankly, is if the, the people who are out there, all of us in society, support that kind of concept, then that's really what helps give us that bargaining power. It starts with our own members in the workplaces, but it's bigger than that. It's also society. If society demands that grocery workers should be paid more, then they'll be paid more, right? If society demands that we need a real long-term care system, and that means we have to have people who are paid appropriately and are dedicated to the system, then we'll be able to achieve that. And I think that narrative is there now, and I am certainly hopeful that that continues, and not that I'm happy that we're all trapped in places like my beautiful attic office here, but the fact that this isn't just going to be gone in 2 weeks will help us do that. It'll start sinking in the narrative that this is the new world. The old world wasn't great. The relentless pursuit of capital has led us to having a humongous problem here that didn't really need to happen, and we should start reframing it. And so really for me as a trade union representative, what will really be helpful is if that narrative stays and the public supports it, then we'll really be able to achieve some good stuff.
Jamie?
Yeah, what I'd like people watching this to do, and I know that's an uncomfortable situation, but anyone who right now is concerned about making ends meet, that paying their rent or mortgage, buying food, any of those things, I want you to think about that feeling and how it feels right now. And imagine the number of workers who feel like this all the time. All the time. Not that the pandemic will end. When it ends, it'll go back to normal, or as Tim was saying, it'll drop down to lower wages. But there are people out there who are working precarious jobs or minimum wage who can't make ends meet, who are struggling every single day, who will go get groceries and put certain things back because they can't afford it in their budget. We really have to drive this home with people, because we'll forget. We'll recover, we'll move forward, we'll forget, we'll get to the next election. Someone will say buck a beer and we'll all dance towards it. But we're screwing over a generation of workers, quite frankly. We cannot spend time on the side of the road banging pots and pans and saying that these workers are heroes, these healthcare workers, these retail workers are heroes, and at the same time say that we don't believe that they deserve more than minimum wage, or we don't deserve that minimum wage should rise. We can't say that healthcare is important without paying PSWs a fair wage, or privatizing healthcare, or telling these workers that you don't even deserve more than 1%, which is less than the cost of living. We can't talk out of one side of our mouth and then do the opposite. And as the public, because as a politician, I always look biased, but I'm telling you, as the public, you got to hold your government's feet to the fire. You have to pick up the phone. As my dad said growing up, politicians like weather vanes, and once in a while you got to remind them which way the wind is blowing. So you got to pick up the phone, you got to call your MPP, your MP, and say, enough is enough. I'm fed up with precarious work. I'm fed up with these low wages. I can't believe that this is what these workers go through all the time. It has to stop for those workers.
That's great, thank you. Let me just find out where I was. This question's for Tim. I promised someone I would ask it. So market uncertainty has many members concerned about their financial security and their future retirement. What's being done to ensure member pensions and benefits are being secured? Oh, did I lose him? His internet left at the right time. Jamie?
Well,
do you have any answers to that on the NDP side?
Well, you know, there's a couple of things when I hear this. So the first one is that we went through something very similar, not the pandemic, but the market's uncertainty in 2009, 2010, when the housing bubble collapsed, mainly out of the States, but it spread all over the place. And really people were worried about it, and stocks were dropping, and a lot of people panicked and pulled out. And really, if you have investments, if you're lucky enough to have investments, and you don't plan on retiring, don't pull out when it's low, right? The ups and downs don't matter. It's where you are at the end of the day. So you know, I think that's important. The other part of this that resonates with me as a New Democrat, you know, and as a steelworker as well, is the work that Scott Duval out of Hamilton has been doing. So federally, Scott Duval is the guy who's been championing with the NDP. He's been championing protecting workers' pensions. He's been bringing this forward since he was a steelworker working at Stelco. He brought this forward as the MP, and a lot of people recognize it with the Sears workers. You can't find a Canadian across this country who thinks what happened to these Sears workers was fair.
I'm listening to it.
Hey, Max. It wasn't fair. And so what happened was is that in Sears they were they bought the company, they paid the shareholders more and more money, they gave the executive bonuses, and at the end of the day they stole the pensions from the workers. And when they went bankrupt, the way the bankruptcy laws are set up right now is that the workers are last in line. The banks get the money first, all the creditors, but the pensioners are last. And you have to realize that pension for workers isn't a gift from God. It's deferred earnings. People put money into it, or instead of getting a raise, you get pension, or you contribute towards it. So the idea that the company can rob you of your pension at the end of the day has to change. And Scott's been bringing this forward during the Harper's days. He's been bringing this forward now through the Liberal days. And this has to stop. This has to end. This idea that pension is a magical gift that you get. And also, as workers, we have to stop looking at pension as something where we go, well, I don't have it, why should you get it? And change that into, you have it, why don't I have it? Like I said earlier, we got to go away from talking about jobs and talking about careers. And careers have pensions so that when you retire, you have money in your pocket so you can keep, you know, living in your home. You can keep spending money in local businesses. And that when you need to go to long-term care or something like that, you have some money set aside for that as well.
Tim, we were just talking about, it was a question that one of your members had reached out for me to ask, and it was about, they were concerned about market uncertainty and how many people are, like, they were concerned about the financial security of their retirement and wondering what UFCW was doing to protect their benefits and pensions.
Sure. Well, sorry I disappeared on folks there. There's Wi-Fi situation in my Century home is a little interesting at times. So look, I mean, as a union, where we have existing pension plans through our collective agreements, then we try very hard to make sure that they're secure. There's a whole variety of different kinds of saving programs that are out there. We always tried to put into place defined benefit pensions that would provide for somebody a stable level of income when they were in their retirement. And especially in the last decade, we've seen the business side really push hard on trying to get rid of those and instead move into what they call defined contributions, where there's only a fixed amount of money they're putting in that doesn't guarantee anybody a benefit when they go. And that's where people really start getting worried about, well, how are the investments doing? Are they going to be there? I mean, right now we're tracking for a major recession that's going to dramatically affect people's savings, and that's going to be very problematic. So as much as we can, we're maintaining defined benefit pension plans throughout our collective agreements. We are working to maintain the ones that we have and make sure that they're invested in solid investments that can return. When we are looking at other areas and what we can do, we're trying to find avenues for them. And this is a substantial problem. I mean, this is a problem with this so-called new economy and the gig economy, is that those kinds of systems are not really in place for people. And if you're relying solely on what the government is providing, I mean, the Canada Pension Plan is there, and it's something I think that is valuable for Canadians, and we'd certainly like to see expanded, but it really isn't something you can live on. So a lot of the work that we're trying to do with the union too is where we get into these sort of deregulated sectors or spread out sectors is what can we do to find people saving vehicles and make sure that they do have something that when they wish to stop working and want to enjoy the rest of their life, that they've got money to be able to do that.
Thank you. So what we're going to do next is I have one last question. However, I just want to put everyone's attention to the chat section. So if any of you have any links, any of the panelists have any links that you want to put in there, by all means, I'm going to add, and then I'm going to ask ask the last question, see if there's one more question out with the audience, and then just provide a little bit more info, and then we'll be done. So thank you very much. I know it's 8 o'clock now, but I think that we can push it just a little bit more. Conversation's been so great. Thank you. So I'm going to direct this. We'll start with Shandel on this one. This pandemic has been referred to as the Great Revealer, on how our social safety net was not much of a net, but more like pieces of string barely holding it all together in the first place. What are your hopes coming out of this pandemic and how it could shape our society for the better?
As I've said before, this is a tremendous time. Like, this is a great time for change. We're really seeing all the flaws in the system, and we're coming together and being like, these are solutions that could make it better, that could repair it. So it's a time to change the precariousness of so many workers that we're now seeing, how essential they are. The workers before that, they were saying, oh, well, they got my coffee wrong in the drive-thru, so why would I give them $15 an hour? Well, that same person is now exchanging money as you buy your groceries that you have needed for the last week because of the fact that we're in a global pandemic. They're putting their life on the line. Do they deserve $15 now? So we're seeing that how essential they are, even though how they're in such a precarious position, and that we cannot continue to function like that. Like, it won't work. So it's an extraordinary opportunity to really put a spotlight on all of the flaws, all these holes that we're seeing in our social system. And it comes back to that conversation. It's a time to talk about that, not in the context of what was wrong or how they were wrong and how they weren't working, but how we can make them better, how we can close them, or how we can build those bridges to make the systems better. It's not going to be something that is going to happen overnight. As I think Jamie said it, they've been working 15 years to just increase the minimum wage, so it's going to take a really long time to fix what we've been breaking, but it's also not impossible. So if we think to ourselves now, I can't wait for things to get back to normal. We didn't pull the lesson from everything that's happening. We didn't learn it. We kept our eyes closed and our heads down. So instead, it's just a great time and a really important time to be proactive and think, how can I make things better? How can we as a society start to fix the system, how to repair the system, and to ensure that everybody receives protection, in a day-to-day life. Things happen, pandemics happen, fires happen, floods happen. The world continues to revolve, and we need to keep that in mind, that day-to-day life will come back. But what do we want that day-to-day life to look like? It should not have taken a global pandemic for people to finally realize that the majority are struggling daily. So we need to have those important, like I said, those very important, possibly very uncomfortable conversations now to ensure a better and equitable change later on.
Jamie?
There's not a lot to add to that. Shandel nailed it. I got to say, the reality is, for years and years, we were promised trickle down. So for me, that started with Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney and Margaret Thatcher saying that if we put all the money at the top, it'll trickle down. And over the years, we've seen more and more proof that this isn't happening. We're seeing, the 1%, which came out, during the We Are the 99 protests. The 1% are getting richer and richer. The middle class is basically evaporating. People are finding more and more difficult ways to make ends meet. And we're struggling on this. And we have the solutions. Tim has been talking about this. Shandel's been talking about them. They're out there, and we can demand them, because if in government, and just over the last 2 years, when I think about government forcing gas stations to put up stickers and saying they're going to fine them, government can change license plates from white that was working fine to blue that no one can see in daylight or night. If government can change the site of city council, if they can rip up subway contracts and restart them again, there's all these examples of bad ideas that we had. So we can do the good ideas as well. They're not as monumental as they are. I push back a little bit on it took 15 years to raise minimum wage, because it only took 3 weeks to take away minimum wage. So we don't have to push for 15 years. It's the wherewithal of the government And frankly, I'm trying not to be partisan, but I am a Democrat. I'm just going to tell you, for years now, we've been piggybacking from liberal to conservatives. And in my opinion, what we've been doing is choosing between a punch and a slap. It's either a chainsaw of cuts or a scalpel of cuts, but it's cut after cut after cut. When we talk about privatization, the conservatives privatized 407, the liberals privatized Hydro One. It's the same playbook, just two different things. You need to work on a party that is actually focused on workers. And you know, it's the party I belong to. And I'm not going to be ashamed to talk about that. I came from working class. I grew up in poverty. And this is the party that resonates with me and speaks to me and for me. And this is the party that I believe represents workers best.
Tim?
So, look, I mean, my great hope out of this is that the general mindset of the whole world has changed around this, and that the nonstop, relentless pursuit of capital that we've really got ourselves into is that people can now have that conversation about, well, what do we actually want from society and how do we want it to work? Because this made it, I think, pretty clear, looking at the news, that many people have woken up to it didn't work out great. And especially now that we've hit a problem where it's affecting everybody, that's really obvious. So if that can change and people can start turning their minds to, like, government isn't a bad thing, you know, taxes aren't a bad thing, like, you know, that kind of conversation that is really legitimate and really serious and doesn't get down these partisan wells of, I'm not going to listen to you just because you're somebody who came from a union, or I'm not going to listen to you just because you're somebody who came from the Conservative Party. If we can really get into a system where people have real consultation with a goal of, let's build a real vibrant society, then that would really thrill me. It would really thrill me that we could get into that and find ways to talk about how we're going to build society, because we were going to come to another crisis, whether it was this COVID pandemic or if it was a general economic crisis. I mean, the artificial intelligence conversation, you know, kind of gets set aside, but we were walking to a future where there weren't going to be jobs for people. And so then what do we do? And I'm hoping that now people can see it now and we can head it off and really build a society that will look after all of us.
Good.
I promised I'd open up. There's one more question. There's a question in the chat box here, Tim, if you don't mind. It's just going back to some of your comments about pensions. Do you find employers are against defined benefit pensions specifically, or is there a lot of resistance for all savings vehicles through group benefits?
Defined benefits in particular, because the liability for the employer isn't limited. This is why they don't like it, right? Like everybody is now into fixed costs. So with a defined contribution, I'm going to match your RSP contribution up to a certain level as the employer. I can budget for that. It's X amount per employee. With a defined benefit, they have to fund it in order to make sure that somebody is getting that monthly benefit, whatever it is. And so you know, that can be a large amount. And this is part of where, when things like Nortel went wrong and when they shut down Sears and these things, this is there is an unfunded liability in those plans, and then the employers just want to walk away and not top them up. So that's a lot of where we hear from the employer is just that, look, it's impossible to fund. We don't want to fund it. We don't think it's our problem. Frankly, a lot of the discussion is around that. And I mean, this sort of goes back to my comments a moment ago about changing people's perspectives. And it ties in with something that Jamie said, is unfortunately people got really convinced that if somebody had something good, that the solution was to take it away from them instead of getting it for themselves. And so, you know, we get resistance, frankly, sometimes from our own members when we look to try to, through collective bargaining, maintain pension. We get some people who are more interested in getting hourly increases and not investing money in that, and that causes difficulty. When employers come up with second-tier systems where they say, well, all new hires will go on a defined contribution, sometimes it's difficult to convince people who are the existing employees that they should worry about people to come, right? So we really try, that's a struggle that we have, is to try to convince people it's about the whole good, not just our sole good. That's a lot of the principle of the labor movement, is that we're all in it together. And that's been a challenge around pensions. So I hope people's mindset changes around that, and it can turn into, we need to worry about these things, and we need to find vehicles that will be there long term to look after people. But in short, that was a lot of talking about a little. Resistance in general about saving vehicles, especially defined benefit. I haven't seen a new one in at least the last 7 years go in. And if anything, it's a shift to try to get out of them into defined contributions, or even less than that, sometimes just contributions into a tax-free savings account.
Thank you. There's one more question in the chat box, and it actually is very timely because it was going to be tied into kind of my exit statement. So it's about cognitive dissonance, and it's something that I know is something that concerns me as well, is that, you know, how do we avoid, I'm going to just say what the question is here, but how do we avoid the Great Awakening being followed by the Great Forgetting from the general public once things start to improve and the pain feels less widespread? Ultimately, the consumer has power to demand better standards from employers. People want to go back to everything fast and cheap and ignoring what was, you know, who was most vulnerable in the labor force. And how do they want to know, how do we avoid people returning to that state of cognitive dissonance? And I'll just leave that to anyone who wants to answer.
I think that's going to be a challenge, because the reality is people have short memories, right? People, you know, look fondly back and they pick and choose what they want. And that's why earlier I said, anyone who is suffering for the first time or the first time in a long time, I want you to hold on to that feeling. I want you to recognize there's people who have that all the time, and by design. It isn't that something, they're in a crisis, it isn't something happening. That is the work that they have. That's the work that's available to them. There is no other work, or they would find that other work. And that's how they live. And as a society, we say that's good enough for them. Or we brush it off and say that minimum wage is okay because those are jobs that people have part-time. Those aren't jobs that parents have full-time with kids, even though we know that it is. Or we say, it's nice to see that there's old people coming back to work at Tim Hortons or delivering newspapers, but don't have conversations with people. I had a conversation with someone in Nipissing last year who told me that their dad, who is in his 80s, delivers newspapers because he has to. Because he has to. It's not about putting extra money in the paper in his pocket. It's that he can't make ends meet without it. We have to not turn a blind eye to that. And that's why, going back to it again, picture what you're feeling right now, that uncertainty, that fear, that anxiousness, that feeling that there's no one to help you, there's no light at the tunnel. Hold on to that and recognize that's how people are feeling day after day, year after year, and demand better from government.
Anybody else want to add to that? Shandel, you took your mic off.
Yeah, well, it's just, there's really not much to add to it other than, you know, like I keep bringing up this conversation that we've all been having, you know, and that's a conversation that needs to continue. And, you know, again, to reiterate, it's going to be uncomfortable. It could be awkward, especially to those who aren't necessarily feeling the effects or feeling them as bad. A friend of mine, I broke social distancing, I'll admit, but it was an agreed upon thing. She's without vehicle right now, and she's almost 9 months pregnant, so she needed to go out. I have a vehicle, so we went out, and she was telling me that her husband had mentioned something along the lines of, people have to learn to live off of $2,000 a month, you know, which is something that her and I have been doing for as long as we can really remember, you know, like how are these people supposed to do it? Like, and it goes back to the point that Jamie has been making, you know, people need to hold on to that, because it's a whole, the system has completely flipped, and a lot of people they're coming out of that panic mode and being like, this is reality now, this is the new life. And I don't know how many people are going to get this, but the meme that's been circulating, I believe it's from an Always Sunny in Philadelphia episode, but they're saying these are the people who have no money. These people have no idea how to live without money. They're what's called new poor. We're old poor. So, and I think that kind of really resonates with a lot of people as well, because, you know, again, people for the first time have to learn to live off of so little. And it's something that a lot of people don't really know how to do, or have forgotten how to do, and they're trying to bring that back. And I think that this is what's really going to create a catalyst for change. And we need to hang on to that. We need to amplify that. We need to, you know, we need to keep putting that out there and being like, this isn't how it was, is not how it has to be.
Tim, that's good.
Yeah, I think I would, the only thing I would add is the opportunity is there now because the situation is primed for this discussion to actually happen. I mean, we're in the situation now, and even when you look at things like what the federal government has done with the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, is if this was only affecting a minor amount of people, or even less of a pandemic, like let's say when SARS happened, still a terrible thing, but much more limited in its scope, you would have gotten some assistance from government and they would have said, that's it, there you go. And that would have been it, that's all. But now with this CERB, we've seen changes to that in response to pressure from the NDP and from other groups, and frankly from business groups saying, we need more, we need to see more come out of here. And so the fact that that's happening, and then it keeps changing, and changing in a good way, in my opinion, by providing for more benefit for more people to give more people need, is an indicator that right now, everybody knows that we need to do something, and that the best vehicle to do that for us is through government. And so I think that there is an opportunity to have that change now. I think those discussions can happen, and we can put pressure on people to start structurally changing it. And some of what will help with that is we'll be dealing with some version of this for at least a year, if not like a year and a half. Even if some of the social distancing gets let go, it's not going to go away completely, or it may come back again if there's a wave. And so that public mindset of we need this, we need assistance, we need government to look after everybody, I think is going to continue for a year. And it's going to be very difficult for some politicians who might want to just go right back again to the capitalist system to get out of it, because we're going to need it, and we're going to need it for a couple of years. So now is the time to put in these things so that they become the new normal and that we don't see them wiped away. I mean, now is the time to have the Tommy Douglas moment where we put in a Medicare system, we put in a pharmacare system, we put in a dental care system, we put in maybe a universal basic income, we put in structurally into our society things that then get too difficult to take away because we all just think they should be there. So let's do that. Let's put some pressure on people.
Thank you. That's great. So just to wrap up, please don't exit yet if you don't mind, participants, but just, you know, we're going to be doing this again. Our riding association, we're going to be hosting more in the future. So I'm just going to kind of put up our link to volunteer, donate, and stay in touch. And I know that a lot of people that are in the audience and in the crowd here may be watching. Really am preaching to the choir, if you will, but if anything, what's been happening here is showing that everything that we do is political, everything. And, you know, where we buy our food, how we get our food, how it gets transported to us, you know, how your friend who's 9 months pregnant gets to the grocery store. I mean, these are all political ramifications. And so if coming out of that cognitive dissonance is, you know, encouraging people to be brave enough to be involved and step up. You know, the reason why I think that in my mind, Nipissing continues to have a bit of cognitive dissonance in general is the fact that, you know, we need to continue to put pressure back on. I do believe that the work that's been done by our riding association and the candidates prior made some incredible gains. So please continue to be involved with your riding associations and putting pressure on the people, as you know, as Jamie said, putting pressure on the people who have the power. Because if they can't handle that pressure, they really shouldn't be in that position, quite frankly. That's my 2 cents. Anyway, so if there's anybody, thank you very much for your participation. I'm incredibly grateful. We're going to do this again. I think we're going to have one on the theme of health, and that's coming together quite nicely. And then if anybody has any other ideas, by all means, let me know. I'll also just like put up my general email. But that's all I have for today. I'm really thankful for the panelists. Thank you very much. And for everyone watching. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, everybody. I'm never leaving. I don't know how.
Don't leave yet. Just want to make sure everything. Yeah, I just want to Just gonna let some people trickle out. Wouldn't mind sending your feedback.
See, Jamie, you knew what you were doing.
I almost made it.
Yeah.